Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. George W. Bush's urban agenda has included an unprecedented commitment to building schools, firehouses, police stations, roads, and other key elements of urban infrastructure. Of course, the cities benefiting from that federal largesse include Baghdad, Najaf, and Kirkuk. Here at home, the story is different. A city like New York suffers from shortages of affordable housing, high numbers of residents without health insurance, a school system still bursting at the seams, and the continuing threat of terrorism that already claimed 2,800 lives on September 11, 2001. But it appears that the presidential campaign is instead focused on two wars, one in Iraq and one that ended 30 years ago in Vietnam. What is George Bush's vision of an ownership society with privatized Social Security and higher levels of home and business ownership mean for New York? Can John Kerry even dream of carrying out promises to reorient national priorities without Democrats achieving unlikely gains to retake at least one House of Congress? We are joined by three prominent New Yorkers to discuss the state of the presidential campaign and what it means for New York. Councilwoman Gail Brewer may be joining us in a bit. Harvey Robbins is Deputy Executive Director with the Children's Aid Society and a former Deputy Schools Chancellor and Operations Chief for the City of New York. Tom Ognebenny is a former Republican leader of the City Council and one-time member of the Republican National Convention Platform Committee. And Professor Nicholas Freudenberg is the Director of the Urban Public Health Program at Hunter College. Mr. Ognebenny, let me start with you before everybody jumps on you as the Republican on the team. President Bush talks about an ownership society. He talks about what would the re-election of George Bush mean for people in New York?
Well, you know, one of the things he wants to concentrate on, I think you're talking about housing now, is that he feels that the best way to build a society is through private home ownership. And there are tremendous initiatives that he's instilled in order to create that. He's low mortgage financing, 0% down payments, and encouraging Fannie Mae and Sonny Mae to make loans available to people so that they can buy affordable housing. We anticipate that there will be an increase of 6.9 million new homeowners as a result of these policies, most of them from the minority community. So we think that that's a great leap forward. Now, we understand that in New York, too, that there are concerns about housing. You're talking about the rental market. And the problem often with that is we're talking about a presidential election. We're talking about somebody who's running on a national level. And the problems that affect housing in New York or other major cities, Philadelphia and Detroit, are quite unique and different. And that's why you have mayors and that's why you have governors, and that's how you address those issues. I happen to think, as other Republicans do, that the problems of New York City are at what's at fault. They're endemic because of their rent structure and rent stabilization and rent control. We're the only major city that still has these controls, which amount to a great extent as a benefit to the most wealthy New Yorkers, because what happens is that you have an apartment that's at $1,500 or $2,000, and a person may be making $10,000 a month, and yet they get that housing at $1,500. A person making $2,000 a month still has to pay $1,500 because it's a controlled apartment. So there are many, many programs that the leadership in New York City, and I'm talking primarily the Democratic leadership, have not allowed to flourish. 80-20 housing, where you build 80% of free market housing, and in exchange the builder has to build 20% completely affordable housing for poor and lower middle income people. We've done none of that. And now we're turning to George Bush, who has a national agenda, who doesn't have an agenda that's unique to New York, but is trying to provide affordable housing on a national level and a universal level. So maybe the policies aren't always effective for New Yorkers, but we have a mayor and we have a governor, and I believe there are policies that can make housing affordable. We just saw that you can go to Albany, we just heard, and get a beautiful luxury apartment for $400. Albany, and there's a glut on the market of available housing. Albany doesn't have the kind of regulation that we do in New York.
Professor Freudenberg, one of the few domestic issues that the two campaigns have engaged on is in fact on health care. I mean, what have they been talking about? How do you view it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we've had a very tough 4 years around health care in this country. There are now about 45 million Americans without health insurance. In any given year, about 80 million Americans at some point in that year without health insurance. the cost of health insurance has gone up 36% in the last 4 years, and the cost of health care has gone up. And essentially, the current administration in Washington has not done anything about these problems. They've not focused on health care because their attention has been elsewhere. And I think in the case of health care, what's good for America and what's good for New York City is pretty much the same. It's developing a national health plan. The United States is the only developed country in the world without a national health plan. It's time for us to rejoin the civilized world and come up with a national health plan. If we look at the particular programs of Senator Kerry and President Bush, they are remarkably different plans and offer a very clear choice to the American people. President Bush's plan, the emphasis is on keeping the government out of health care. He proposes a plan that would result in insuring about 17% of the uninsured. Senator Kerry proposes a plan that would cover about 50% of the uninsured. There's also a very important difference in the plans proposed by the two candidates. The plan proposed by Senator Kerry would save state governments about $343 billion by transferring some of the costs of Medicaid and other health programs to the federal government. The Bush proposed plan would save only about $19 billion for states. And that's a very important issue for New York City. And I think our governor and mayor should really be ashamed of themselves for supporting a presidential candidate who has a health plan that's so bad for New York, both for the people of New York and the economy of New York. New York is really hurting from the costs of Medicaid that we're having to absorb. I think in the view of many public health experts, the Kerry plan doesn't go far enough in having us rejoin the civilized world and having a real national health plan. But it's a step in the right direction, and I think it will be good for New York.
Harvey, what difference does it make to New York who is the president? I mean, Tom makes the point that you have a mayor and a governor who deal with local issues.
Well, I think if we want to talk about the joke of an ownership society, we need to look at some of the statistics in this town. We talked about 25% of the people in New York City are without any health care. Over 80% of those people are working. So they're working and they don't have health benefits. 25% of the people in New York are living in poverty. If you add a couple of more dollars to that number, so people that are living just above poverty, you're talking about close to 40% of the people in New York City. When you look at the minimum wage, which something the president is against and our stellar governor is against, believing that the marketplace should determine what salaries should be, we need to take into consideration the fact that if somebody works 52 weeks a year at $5.10 an hour, they still live in poverty, and they're playing by the rules, working full-time and not earning a living wage. So we have a governor and we have a president that believes that the marketplace should be the basis upon which people should be paid, and then they throw at us this entrepreneur ownership policy that is absolutely meaningless to the grinding harshness of what people live in New York City. When you look at somebody that is now the trading of the jobs that are going on in New York City, the Fiscal Policy Institute did a study that said jobs that are lost and jobs that are returned, people are earning $9,000 on average less than the job that they had before. So for me, this is just this absolute oxymoron, absolute policy that you have a slogan, and yet when you look at people that are working in service jobs that can't make ends meet and sit across a dining room table every night, deciding whether they pay their rent or whether they pay for groceries or whether they pay for medication, to me there is a total disconnect between the rhetoric of both our governor and our president. And New York State, just so that you guys that are history buffs should know, New York State in another era used to set the pattern for minimum wage increases. And now The minimum wage has not been increased for 7 years, and our governor, because he had to give a speech at the Republican convention, needed to score points. Well, to me, scoring points at a convention on the backs of the poor is not fair. It's not the role of government, and it's a sham.
Tom, when you talk, part of the ownership society idea is to put more and more kind of, and this is, I think it's a double-edged sword, but to kind of move towards individual accounts for Social Security, to move towards individual health accounts, is what Dr. Freudenberg Nick was referring to. You know, it seems that there are costs, that there are social costs to people who would have the, an inability to make maximum use of those plans.
Well, when you talk about health, we've been trying to come up with plans that have worked now for like 12 or 13 years. I think Hillary Clinton was supposed to be the guru who was going to create a national health plan. She looked at it and it failed. President Bill Clinton looked at that and it failed. I happen to think we have great health care in the United States. I really do. I think you get the best doctors, and even under managed care you do. We know people say that up in Canada and other places we have a national health care system, and they cite, but you have to wait for months what you can get here in a matter of days or weeks. So I think we have an effective health care system. It is true that we're in areas where you have poverty, that those that are in poverty are the ones that are going to struggle. We talked about saving $343 billion to states. I don't know what that means, because ultimately states don't pay taxes, people do. So if you're not spending $343 billion by the state, the federal government is. What the Democrats never talk about is where the money's going to come from that's going to pay for this, how it's going to be administered, who's going to benefit and who's not going to benefit. One of the biggest problems we have today in providing health care is the runaway cost. It's making it almost impossible, even for working people who have good jobs. Employers want them to pick up some of the costs. One of the reasons is that the cost of doing business for a doctor because of malpractice right now is skyrocketed, and they're now taking up a major portion of health care. Who's the Democratic vice presidential candidate? John Edwards. What did John Edwards do in his real life? John Edwards was a malpractice lawyer who made millions and millions, along with his other friends, in the Trial Lawyers Association in malpractice claims. So you have somebody running for vice president of the United States right now who is not interested in tort reform, which is a significant package of being able to provide medical care to the poor. John Kerry has a lot of wonderful plans and cites the cost of it, but he doesn't tell us where the cost is going to come from and what's going to be the burden on the American people. Health care is something that has to be looked at. In New York City, we have a Health and Hospitals Corporation. As a matter of fact, if you're poor in New York and you don't have the resources, it's the one place that you can go and get excellent medical care, regardless of whether you have health insurance or not. And it's available for everybody. And even in the private hospitals, you can get emergency care without reference to whether you have a health plan or not. So I think it's disingenuous to say that we don't have effective health care. Would we like to all see it better? Yeah, I think we would. But I think a lot of the problems are endemic in areas where there's high poverty. And I don't think anybody has come up with a plan, a responsibly financial plan that can provide health insurance to everybody. But I think the president, I just have some ideas, and I wrote them down because I noticed that I'm not an expert in everything the president does, but he's expanded community and rural health centers. He thinks that that's important. He's extended eligibility under Medicaid, lowered drug costs, created a Medicare prescription drug benefit. And of course he does, as you say, allow some Americans to make it available to them that they could put aside some of their earnings into a health care plan. You say a privatization, but privatization means there'll be no other forms of health care. This is a separate and independent that some people want to take advantage of. The president's job is to serve all Americans. Where you have these endemic problems associated with the poor, there are other levels of government. Now, we know that Medicare cost on New York City is outrageous. Why? Not because of the federal government, it's because of the state government. It's because of Mario Cuomo, who started the policy that New York City has to pick up its cost or a portion of its cost of Medicaid. Every other state picks up the cost. They don't ask any municipality to do so. That was something that was started under Mario Cuomo. I'm sorry to say that our governor has continued that same policy. But that's a unique cost to New York City that I think is unfair to the members of New York City.
I'd like to respond to a few of those things. And I think as the president often does, saying something doesn't make it so. And I think that there were a number of assertions you made that just aren't borne out by the facts, and I will just take up a few of them. First, that we have the best healthcare system. Americans pay more for healthcare than any other country. We are 48th in the world in longevity in this country. Our infant mortality rate is 37th in the world. So we spend more, and yet our health isn't better. So I don't think we have the best health system in the world, and I don't think, perhaps wealthy people do. Wealthy people get very good health care in this country because it depends on what you pay.
You know,
Let me finish.
Well,
You
all right,
had a lot to say.
because I want to have rebuttal to that about the wealthy, because I hear that too often.
Second, you were suggesting that the health problems in this country are problems of poor people. Not so. 80 million people in this country were without health insurance at some point. Many senior citizens have to choose between buying food and getting their prescription drugs. You mentioned the prescription drug plan that was signed by the president at the end of 2003. And I think that's a plan that provided very meager benefits for our senior citizens and very generous benefits for the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry, and the managed care industry, all industries that are supporting the president and supporting his re-election effort. And I think in the opinion of most health experts, that plan is not likely to change what senior citizens are needing to pay out of their pocket for health care. I think the reason we haven't had a health care affordable, decent health care system in this country is not because it's so complicated. Every other country in the world has figured out a way to do it. It's because the special interests, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry, the insurance industry, have obstructed change that would benefit people, that would reduce their profits.
How long have they been obstructing it? Tell me how long they've been obstructing it.
A very long time. And
even when Bill Clinton was president?
Absolutely. That's why that was a very important reason why that plan failed, because the insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industries opposed it. I agree. They made some mistakes in explaining their plan and in building support for it. But the primary reason it failed was special interests derailed it. And as long as the special interests are allowed unfettered access to the White House, to Congress, we're going to have these same problems. And that's really why not only do we need a new president, but we also need campaign finance reform. We need to change how people vote. We need to increase the participation, particularly of young people in the political system, because they're the ones who are being poorly served by our current set of policies.
I think the other issue is that over the last 40 years, the role of government, whether it's the national level of government, the state level of government, has really been beaten back. And the mantra today is about big business, big corporations, and the unfettered marketplace knowing all the answers. And so what has happened is, over the last 40 years, the amount of money that was collected by taxes from corporations have gone down. In the last 25 years in New York City alone, the share of corporate taxes to the city's treasury has declined because corporations and their accountants have figured out ways to offshore by opening up a mail drop in the Cayman Islands or in Ireland, so that the corporate profits have gone through the ceiling, but the amount of money that comes to both the city and the state continues to decline. And so what we have is bankruptcy on the part of states, bankruptcy on the part of cities, and what we've seen is that while the rhetoric is that everything is fine, the reality on the ground, whether it's in a state or whether it's in a city, is that they move from boom to bust times, and people have no level of certainty about the level of service or the level of commitment that the levels of government are supposed to provide. For me, what I see has happened is 40 years ago, we talked about the role of government helping those that are afflicted. Today, what we see is the role of government and the media making sure that the corporations are taking care of it, everyone else is afflicted. Now, that's an incredible arc to have marched in the last 40 years. And so government is being seen as not even a last resort. It is seen as a stepchild, and the only game in town is the corporation, and using the term accounts, individual accounts for individuals that earn $30,000, $35,000 a year, when people can't make a grocery bill, to tell me that they're going to put money away in savings is just not reality.
Well, but we're talking about people who would be putting money into the case of Social Security accounts that they now pay in payroll taxes. There would be some of their money, instead of putting it into a payroll tax, into a mass system, you would have some control over your own, you could make your own investments, you could have your own sense of, you could have some control over your own destiny.
Well, but I think it's really, the question is, are we all in this together, or is every guy out for himself and every woman out for herself? The health savings account, which is the signature piece of the Bush health care proposal, would offer individuals the chance to pay in and get their own health insurance. The problem with that is...
And the government would finance some additional portion in order to make the health insurance.
Yeah, there'll be a matching fund.
Right.
The problem with that is that would, what people in the insurance industry cream off the healthiest people. And so who's left to be supported by the existing insurance programs, Medicare and Medicaid, are the least healthy people. And so that puts the burden on the rest of the taxpayers and the rest of the government. So the people who are best off benefit from these programs, and the people who are worst off either don't get the health care they need or are reliant on the taxpayers. It's a patently unfair system that might benefit a few people but hurt society as a whole, both in terms of health and in terms of finances. And that's why I think this notion of ownership, it's ownership for a select few, and not really addressing what are the needs, not just of poor people, not just of urban people, but of, you know, the vast majority of Americans who need decent health care, who need decent housing, who need a job. Another very important dynamic of the healthcare crisis is that we're losing jobs. In Michigan last year, a quarter of the manufacturing plants laid off workers in order to contain healthcare costs. The fact that we haven't been able to bring healthcare costs under control is losing more jobs in this country, and we're already losing a lot. So we really need to come up with a plan that will address some of these dynamics.
Tom, for 70, Social Security is almost 70 years old. I think it's 1935, isn't it?
33, I think.
30, so it's over 70 years old now.
I know that because my grandfather made one payment to Social Security and collected till he was 95.
Good for him. One of the whole idea of Social Security is that we all pool our money and we support those who are old. And we know the vagaries of the stock market. We've seen all these additional profits. The stock market has been stagnant for the last 4 years, certainly. The danger of people trusting their own investment skills, and the possibility / likelihood in some cases that amount of money will go down, and you will wind up again a burden on taxpayers for, you know, especially for senior citizens, not necessarily for health. I mean, does that cause you concern? I mean, there's no reason that people couldn't continue to make their basic payments into Social Security and set up a 401k with any additional money.
First of all, I don't think that Social Security is invested very well. I think there's a lot of opportunities remaining safe to get a better return on the amount of money that's invested in Social Security than the government can do.
Investment carries risk.
Yeah, but there's a certain amount of investment. You don't have to. There's certain investments that we know when we do 401k that you can go and you could take high risk, low risk. There are certain investments I think that Social Security is poorly managed from the point of view of responsible investment. I think it's important to state this. I always thought of Social Security growing up as what it was called in the very beginning, federal old age insurance. It was really to benefit people like myself who are approaching that age. The Democratic Party has now turned it into a generalized welfare fund. SSI now has overtaken the payments in SSI, which is supplemental security income to persons under the age of 62, is now greater than those payments that go to persons over 62. In a sense, Social Security was raped. There was never a problem with Social Security if the original intent of it was to be old age insurance, and that a person collected when they were 62 or they were 65 or 66, whatever the limit that you put on it. So it's problematic that the Democrats who now created all the problems, who altered the intent of it, now claim that that the Republicans are the ones that want to destroy it. We really don't want to destroy it. What we want to do is find better investment vehicles so that people can get a better return on their investment than what they're getting from Social Security presently. Does it have to be high-risk investment? No. I think there should be some controls on it. I don't think it's going to be unfettered investment, because I don't think it's wise that people should use money that they otherwise would need in their old age to invest in buying options, for instance, on the stock market. But I think that there's a better opportunity for them to do some investment on their own and to opt to do it. And there are plenty of programs in which you could receive more than a 1.5% to 2% return. So it's a mismanaged system. It's also been raped, and Social Security benefits are now going to people who would never contemplate it by Social Security, and that's a failure of the Democratic Party.
Well, I think the failure has to do with the fact that Bush's own Commerce Secretary held meetings and told corporations how to offshore their taxes and how to offshore their jobs. And so to me, when we're talking about where there has been literally bleeding and hemorrhaging of tax dollars that we could use right here at home, so that corporations that are making 50 and 60% profit, we're not seeing anywhere relationships to that back into the treasuries. And to me, we have a bogus discussion about not having enough money in the treasury when an arm of government is telling us how to ladle the money across the seas into the Cayman Islands.
I don't even know anything about that. Have you got some documentation on that?
Yes, you should listen to Lou Dobbs every night on CNN.
I don't necessarily buy into Lou
well,
Dobbs
but he was
either.
He was hired on CNN as the business commentator, and every night he talks about offshore jobs and
offshore. He has to pick. I don't know how much money is going offshore, but I really don't. I'm not an accountant. I don't know that. But people will seek some relief where the government taxation burden is overwhelming.
But let's talk about taxation.
That wouldn't be the United States.
Because this is a critical, because we have, this is a unique time in history in the sense that we have mammoth expenses for the war in Iraq, and to a lesser degree the war in Afghanistan, at the same time that the president is trying to make tax cuts permanent that he pushed through in 2001.
Absolutely.
And that we have seen trillions of dollars of surplus go to trillions of dollars of projected deficit now. Now, my children, I have a 7.5 and a 6, they're going to be paying off those bills, because I happen to think one of the wondrous achievements of the Clinton administration was taking advantage of a good economy and paying down the national debt. And Republicans were traditionally the party that didn't want to run debt. Is it irresponsible? You're a Republican long enough to remember a time when Republicans were the party of a balanced budget. Does it cause you concern?
I think there are some unique circumstances that we have now. This country was attacked. This country is under siege, and the reason that we were under siege is because we spent 8 years in the previous administration ignoring the attacks, and finally we took a death blow in 2001. And our president felt that this country had to be defended. And he felt this country had to be defended by attacking al-Qaeda. And that isn't just Afghanistan.
No, but the question has to do with the sacrifice that the president asks people to make. Yes. And he has not asked people to make a sacrifice.
And especially not rich people.
And every other president in previous years that went to war.
Wealthy. For instance, you said before that only wealthy people can get good health care, and I think that's a little bit unfair. I'm not wealthy, and I'd venture to say there are many people that I know that belong to unions that have good plans that get excellent health care. And I think always raising the issue that it's the wealthy against the poor is kind of an unfair counterpoint to make. There is plenty of affordable health care for working people in the city. And you don't have to be wealthy to get good housing.
And the polls show that huge proportions of Americans are dissatisfied with their health care. They're dissatisfied with the cost of it.
But they will always be.
They're dissatisfied with the quality.
Will always be.
Now,
absolutely. Everybody would like to have, I would like to have better health care. I don't like necessarily going to a managed care and having to see my family doctor and then get a referral to a cardiologist. But I understand that's the limits. I understand that if I was making $2 million a year, I could go to a cardiologist. Yes.
At some of the other countries that have done a much better job of making health care accessible, you find the levels of satisfaction much higher, despite the...
I tell you, I think that Americans generally always want more. I don't know, and I know this anecdotal evidence, and you're being sincere when you present it, but I'm not so sure.
I'm actually presenting national polls. that have looked at what you're presenting as
I tell you, as a politician, I never believe in polls because I could word a question that begs the answer. So it's unfair for you to cite polls because I understand how pollsters work, and they can push an answer, and I don't know if they understand what I mean, but you could create an answer that you want to hear by asking a question.
But the reality is, when you come back to Bob's word, let's use the word sacrifice, okay? This president took us to war. Whether we agreed with his position or not, he took us to war, but he didn't ask us to go to sacrifice. He asked us to go shopping. And at the same time, he gave huge tax breaks to corporations. Those are all three realities. No sacrifice, corporations ladling tremendous tax abatements, and the fact that now there's no money to do anything, whether it's healthcare or housing or anything else. He created this box, and now he's saying, now let the individual figure it out. Well, I'm sorry, I don't play by those rules. I don't believe the role of government is to put individuals in a box and have them in a harsh situation when government could have made a different set of choices. And in the previous times when we went to war, we raised taxes. We didn't cut the corporations' taxes.
I'd like to talk about a couple other issues that I think really affect New York.
Because you do want to go to, but bring them up and then I'm going to go to a question.
One is the environment. And the other is women's health. And I think these are two other issues where there are very sharp differences between the two people running for president. Around environment, you know, George Bush, by many accounts, is the worst environmental record of any president in U.S. history by failing to take action against global warming. He's really endangered the long-term well-being of this country. And there's I think, very solid scientific evidence that even his own advisors now accept requires action. On the case of women's health, and sexuality more broadly, we've seen an administration that has promoted abstinence education, spent more than $1 billion over the last 4 years in abstinence education, despite the fact that there's no scientific evidence that it has any effect at all. And by those actions, putting people at risk, you know, putting young people at risk in their refusal to support family planning internationally. They have created, by one group's estimate, 800,000 unwanted pregnancies and 2 million additional abortions, simply by not providing the support that this country had provided for years and years under both Republican and Democratic administrations to international groups.
You want to get very quickly?
It's interesting that George Bush is responsible for multiple illegitimate births and global warming. I wouldn't even know how to respond to that.
By not taking action.
So he's responsible for global warming?
That's not what I said.
Well, he pulled out of the Kyoto Accords, and
That's
so
right.
I mean, you did have a war, and you did have a world agreement, and the United States was committed to that agreement, and he backed out of that agreement. So let me go to the question. Tell us your name and tell us what campus you're from, and speak up, please.
Harun Chaudhary, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I have a question about the unemployment. Nearly 2 million jobs have been lost in America over the past 4 years. Some people argue that this job loss is because of the post-9/11 recession. However, it's also clear that many jobs in the service and technology sectors are being exported to developing countries, where labor is less costly. Which party has a clear plan to handle this situation, like to keep the jobs in the United States and the people who have already lost the job to create new jobs for them?
Well, I can tell you that the president doesn't see there's a problem with this economy, and every day he says we're fine, we're on the right track, and he believes that that the marketplace is operating as he would like it to be.
Well, what has Kerry said? Kerry has talked about there are certain tax benefits now to moving jobs overseas,
And he's going to pull the plug on those.
So I mean, Kerry has made a point with some fairly strident language. Early in the campaign, during the Democratic primaries, talking about people's questioning companies' patriotism who move jobs overseas. I thought it was quite strong language. Anybody else want to jump in on that? Or, sorry, tell us your name and the campus you're from.
Yes, my name is Isa Achiachi. I'm from Hunter College. My question is concerning ownership society. I happen to have benefited from the housing opportunity that the government offers. As a student, I own an apartment in New York City. And my question would be to Professor Nicola Freudenberg. How do you feel, sir, about the new program developed by the New York City in which they build house for low-income families to allow them to own?
I very much support that plan. I think that housing, and especially low-income housing, is not an issue that the market does very well with, and that if we are going to be a society that says people have a right to housing, then there is important for government to take a role in that. And we have seen in this current Republican administration in Washington a dramatic decline in the support for low-income housing. And that is very harmful to cities across the country, and especially to New York City. And so I think that a new administration would revisit those priorities and put more emphasis on making housing a right, not a privilege in this society.
Tom, just to do it up, we are joined by the magic of television by Councilwoman Gail Brewer. How are you?
Mortified.
Let me ask Tom this question, and Gail, I'm going to get you to jump in on it. Another part of the housing is not only affordable housing. What are the benefits of people owning homes? What are the idea of increasing the number of people owning homes? I mean, it seems to me that if you own a home,
you have a greater stake in
stake in
a much greater stake, particularly in community. Those collateral issues that affect the community in terms of policing, in terms of safety, in terms of having a viable schools. One of the things that you're very much interested in, general overall safety in the community. So I think that the emphasis on home ownership is something that's extremely important, even here in New York. I think the more ownership that you have in a community, the more stable you'll find. You know, the old theory was that you created public housing, high-rise public housing, and what they found was that this wasn't effective in making people identify with their community. Now with the newer programs like Nehemiah Housing, where they have 2- and 4-family units, where you have ownership and some rental mixed in, but you have this, what they call, 1- and 2-story housing, rather than going with the massive erected projects, which simply were well-intentioned but didn't work. But I do believe.
I grew up in one that worked for me.
Well, I think generally you don't get the same sense of community that you do with the smaller type housing. But I do think that we're going to have to revisit, New York City and New York State have to revisit rent stabilization and rent control, because I think that there are alternate plans where you can protect those of limited income in terms of housing, but you can create some affordable housing. As a city councilman, I always thought that should have been a priority of the city council to create affordable housing. And one of the programs I talked about that the city always rejected was that 80-20, where you gave a developer a chance to build 80 units in Manhattan that were free market units, which could easily be supplied, but he had to go into Bushwick, he had to go into Ridgewood, and he had to create housing, 20 units that were basically almost rent-free, or certainly easily affordable. And I think there was an easier way of doing it. And I said the problem that we have, that I always saw with rent stabilization, is that you have a unit and the stabilized rent may be $1,800. That's a lot, and it's an awful lot of rent for somebody who's making $35,000 a year. But if somebody's making $150,000, $250,000 a year, why should they get the benefit of the $1,800 rent? Doesn't make any sense to me. And I think you're better off that person paid $4,000 rent and the person making $35,000 paid $500 rent. And the owner wouldn't mind at all because his rent roll doesn't significantly change, the overall doesn't, but you get a better benefit. And particularly senior citizens, and I was at the city council, and those that were opposed to that used to have people come in to testify. They were all the seniors who screamed at me because I wanted to do away with rent stabilization. And I used to tell them, you're paying $800 for an apartment that I think you ought to pay $300 for. The problem is the guy making $80,000 is paying $800 for that apartment.
This is about the hottest issue around, Tom, I think, yes. The issue of rent stabilization. I certainly, representing the west side of Manhattan, we have probably more rent stabilized, I think, than any place else in the city, and rent controlled. And I'm a big supporter of tenants, and I do support rent stabilization and rent control, although it would be great if we could all be homeowners. But the fact of the matter is there are about 2 million renters, some market and some rent stabilized, in the city of New York. And I do believe that renters can be and are a stabilizing force, at least in my neighborhood. A lot of the parents that come out of the Mitchell-Lama housing, which is both limited equity co-op meaning that you go in with a ceiling on your income, as well as renters end up being the unbelievable parent leaders in the neighborhood, as an example, or the leaders of the Block Association. So I think it depends on the neighborhood. On the west side, we do have people who have a lot of money who are in rent stabilized. But I can tell you, I really honestly believe this, it is a little bit on the press side in terms of the majority. It is definitely middle income, sometimes with people in public school or just trying to make it in private school, so you need a rental that you can afford. You may have a $100,000 income, but if you've got 3 kids and you've got an ailing parent and you've got other challenges, maybe you have a student that for whatever reason, special needs to be in private school, or you just want to send your kids to private school, then your rent has got to be something that you can deal with.
Yeah,
so I'm going to say it's a mixed bag in terms of rent stabilization. It is.
Let me just ask you also, try to, since we're talking about the presidential election, we just saw recently where Section 8 vouchers, which were a rental assistance program that allows a lot of people to remain. It gives you a certain amount of a voucher, and then you have to pay the difference between that voucher and the market rent, and allows thousands and thousands of New Yorkers to stay in their apartments. When you look at the 2 presidential candidates, the Bush administration just backed off a proposal that would have made that a much more difficult situation. How do you assess the 2 presidential candidates?
Well, people talk about so many issues, international, environment. When I talk about the difference between the 2, Bush and Kerry, I always mention that as my first topic, is the Section 8. Because Section 8 allows not just renters to be live in a community, but it also helps the owners of the building because it gives them a guaranteed rent no matter what. And so I always look at it as a program that is of equal benefit to the resident, but also to the owner. And it's a real estate proposal as well as a rental proposal. It is so needed. It keeps the housing development going, and it keeps the Mitchell-Lama, which is a middle-income family, stabilized. So it's a variety of Section 8 that is helpful to our urban neighborhoods. It is the #1 issue, in my perspective, for being.
Has Kerry talked about or has Kerry's people talked about the issue?
I don't think, as a strong Democrat, that anybody has talked enough about affordable housing in this campaign.
Right. I think Section 8 is also important as a homelessness prevention program, and from a public health point of view, the outburst of homelessness in the early 1980s when President Reagan ended federal support for low-income housing was followed by terrible epidemics. Tuberculosis surged in New York City.
Well, that was really I think more to immigration even than it was to
not at that
issues.
time.
No? Okay.
No, now it is, but at that time it had to do with crowding people in shelters, a terrible situation for transmission of tuberculosis. And also contributing to the spread of drug addiction. And so I think having low-income housing, keeping people housed, really protects the health of the city as well as makes the city a better place for all of us to live.
Let me go to another question, sir. Tell us your name and what campus you're from.
Yes, my name is Carlos Sierra. I'm from Lehman College. My question is, in light of President Bush's plans to place troops throughout the world, to liberate countries that are suffering from poverty, what plans does President Bush has to liberate countries like Sudan and Haiti that are suffering from poverty?
Well, this is not a foreign policy panel, but I think what you're saying is there's the genocide, if you will, that's going on in the Sudan, that you saw a tremendous amount of pressure. I think people learned from inaction in Rwanda in particular, and you've now seen the Americans actually have one of the louder voices in attacking the Sudanese government. Does anybody else want to jump on that?
Well, it's a sensitive issue. One of the reasons that we go into other countries.
Cheney doesn't like the word sensitive, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm a sensitive guy. When we go into other countries, we do it because we want to protect the interests of the United States. And once you start going into other countries because you want to intercede in internal struggles, you have to be very careful. Now, I understand there's certain issues in which you just simply, the genocide is just overwhelming. It's really disgraceful. But I think that when I say a sensitive issue, I think the United States gets a lot of criticism for doing it, and I'm a person that's in favor of it. And this is one of the areas where I think the UN falls down miserably. because I think if there was ever a reason for the creation of the UN, it was to take the lead on this. The United States takes the lead. We're hated for, as it is now internationally, and I think if the UN was resolved to send troops in, the United States could send the bulk of the troops in. But I don't think that at the position that we're in now internationally, that we can unilaterally go into these countries like Haiti and the Sudan. I just think that, so, you know, we'll look at the last time with Somalia. We tried to do the right thing over there, and that was a terrible situation.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Aram Doi, Hunter College. I want to go back to healthcare. We see folks traveling all the way to Canada to get prescription drugs where it's a lot cheaper. So my question is, why do you think prices are skyrocketing in the U.S., and do you think a national healthcare plan would remedy to that?
I think the pharmaceutical industry has really pulled a trick on us. And what they say is that the reason that drugs are so expensive in this country is because of their high research and development costs. But I think what a closer look shows is that, in fact, the development of new drugs in this country is supported by us, is supported by taxpayers, is paid for by the National Institutes of Health. And many of the most important drugs in the last several decades have been developed by government. But then they get turned over to drug companies who spend vast amount of advertising and promoting those drugs. And because every other country in the world has some restrictions on what pharmaceutical industries can charge, here in the United States, they look to to maximize their profits. The pharmaceutical industry is the most profitable industry in the United States, and has been for the last few years. And what we need, I think, is for a government to say, no, we're not going to let you make profits at the expense of the American people. If the taxpayers pay for the development of a drug, then they should benefit from that drug. I think specifically, we should be able to import drugs from Canada. It's a red herring to say that we can't safely do that. And second, we need to find some way to have a stronger government voice towards the pharmaceutical industry.
I certainly agree with Nick on the policy issues, but I just want to say in the City Council, we have a bill that Council Member Joya has introduced, and that will be in my Technology Committee on October 12th, and it's local. What it says is that on the Internet should be listed all the drug prices put out by pharmacies in the City of New York. Now, that doesn't help us import from Canada, but it gives us the opportunity to compare prices here in our city. And it might be a step in terms of what we need for bringing prices down, or at least as a purchaser, before we can get what Nick suggests.
I can just say as a Republican that I'm appalled by the prices of drugs, and I honestly think that something has to be done. I know on a personal level, as somebody who's had some cardiovascular problems, I don't play because I have hip, but I look at the price of the drugs that they print on it, and I simply don't know what I would do if I had to pay for them, even with my income, which is reasonable.
Do you support the proposal to import drugs from Canada?
As a matter of fact, I support that, but I think that you have to be careful with it. I do think that has to be controlled very carefully, and I think it should be done by cities, by municipalities, by states, if they could. I don't know if what the legality of it is, but I think that
the FDA has said they can't.
Well,
there's
some problems with that, but I understand it. But that's not unique. That's not a Republican Democratic issue. Everybody's hands are dirty.
I must tell you, as somebody who, as a reporter, covered Tom Agnebetti, he is not no matter how much of a strong Republican he sounds like, he's actually not a predictable Republican. Yes, sir.
Richard O'Sullivan, John Jay College, for Council Member Brewer. Given the fact that rent control and rent stabilization are probably not going to go away from New York City in a long time, affordable housing is kind of, from a co-op perspective, is not looking very good unless the city steps in. Why can't the city start building 10 and 20-story co-ops, sell them off at lottery, and create some more fair housing?
Well, I agree. Let me just tell you, on the rent stabilization not going away, vacancy decontrol is de facto making it go away, and just to throw that out as an example. But the mayor's proposal, I think, isn't enough, but it's a start. 65,000 units of affordable housing is in the pipeline now. It's everything from some luxury slash affordable in one building to new buildings, although 65,000 is never going to be enough. We have been pushing, what I would love, as an example, is a Mitchell-Lama program. It's a very successful program. It was developed in the 50s and is now, in some cases, not all, some of those units which were built for middle-income families are being phased out, privatized. And in my neighborhood, I have 22 Mitchell-Lamas and 5 or 6 in the process now. And it's a very frustrating process because I think it does provide affordable co-ops and affordable rentals, just what you described. What we want is a Mitchell-Lama program, and it's a state-city financial strain.
Let me go. Do we have another question? Tell us your name and the campus you're from, please.
Good evening. My name is Dowd King, and I'm from Brooklyn College.
Brooklyn College graduate.
Brooklyn College, right. My question is about hip-hop. Recently, we've seen a lot of hip-hop impressionists registering voters and things of that nature. Do you think that's effective, and what do you think is going to be the result?
I think that anybody who registers voters is effective. I'll tell you that also there's a lot of investment in hip-hop. I know that in Brooklyn that there's investment in a hip-hop entrepreneurial academy, which is trying to, through the medium of hip-hop, teaching people business skills, et cetera, et cetera. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a tremendously important, every effort to register new voters. And some people are pessimistic about Senator Kerry's chances. I'm not, and I'm counting on young people in this country to take America in the right direction. There have been hundreds of thousands of people registered in the last several months. I think we're going to see a very different electorate in 2004 than we saw in 2000. And my hope is that the hard work that so many young people of every different kind will pay off, and we'll have higher levels of political participation, and that'll be good for everybody.
I was just, I guess, retained by Baruch College because they have a school of public affairs, and one of the reasons they wanted to get me in there was to develop a program to encourage the kids that go to school. It's a tremendous voting base, and get them to register to vote. I think getting kids to register to vote, make them more aware, force them to become more aware of what the issues are and how they're going to be affected. And I think it's important that somebody like myself also get involved, because I think that there's another side to present. But I'd like to see that. And I think what happens is, though, you get the youngsters registered, and they go out and they vote that first time, and then somehow the interest wanes. And you don't, when we do our research on voters, we find that the first time voting rate is very high, but the second and third time they don't. And certainly, if they do come out again, it's 4 years later in a presidential, and they don't come out for the important elections, like electing people like you and I, who the people have to go to get their pothole, their housing. They don't seem to take the deep interest in that, which I think is a more important vote.
Well, I'm excited because I think that young people, my staff, for instance, doesn't have landlines anymore. They only have cell phones. And you tell me, but the posters are mostly calling landlines, hard wire lines. So I'm very encouraged because young people often have cell phones and they no longer have a home line because it costs too much. And why do they need it anyway? Because they got the cell phone. So the fact of the matter is, since you all are not being polled as young people, you're going to carry the election for Kerry, in my opinion. The second, though, I want to mention in terms of hip hop, we're doing registration in high schools Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And a lot of the hip-hop artists are going to work with us, Rock the Vote. It's very exciting when you see Martin Luther King Jr. High School, Brandeis High School, LaGuardia High School participating, and many of these students are eligible, particularly on the senior level. So I think that young people are the key to this election.
And October 8th is the deadline for registering to vote in New York State.
What are the, if you saw a higher voter turnout, would a higher voter turnout benefit the Democrats?
You'd have to determine where the turnout is. For instance, we were talking over here about the students coming out, and you've got a place in New York where you have this high concentration of population. Frankly, and I'm not trying to be pejorative, but frankly, George Bush doesn't care whether he loses New York City and New York State by 2 million or 4 million votes. The way we're structured, and I think that motivates a lot of his policies. I don't want to go into it. I sit here and talk with you, but honestly, I don't think his policymakers are concerned very much about the needs that were talked about here with respect to New York City. It's a sad part of politics, but it's a real part of politics. So that high voter turnout, low voter turnout, I don't know that it cuts I suppose if it's really dramatically high, it might favor the Democratic candidate. But we've seen that and people don't seem to understand that this is an electoral college, that it's the states that control, and you could win some states by millions and lose other states by 50 votes.
At the risk of, because we only have a couple of minutes left, of opening up another very large topic, which is, I think, and this is particularly important for New York, is the issue of support for first responders, for firefighters and police officers, and the promises that were made after September 11th that, it's my sense, I happen to think that the president did not stiff the city on the $20 billion, and that the last couple of $1 billion, there was a shift in how it was going to be made, and there's some policy shift, and that the city is actually working with the feds. But have you seen, you seen sufficient support for the first responders? Are those promises carried out?
Well, I think the way in which Homeland Security funding was ladled out is a perfect example about the way in which the federal government, and specifically the president, said we're going to give $38 per person in Colorado, and $1 and change here in New York on a per capita. And so to me that was emblematic of how, even out of tragedy, as opposed to looking at the issue of where the need was and where the likelihood of another strike is going to be, and instead it was ladled out in a very disproportionate and unfair way.
And I think the other question is, where does that money come from? And because of the huge deficits that have been incurred by this administration and by the tax cuts for the wealthy, the result has been that money that goes to first responders comes away from other vital functions, from education, from public health, from health care. And so it's a kind of zero-sum game that hurts all of us, not just New York. And I think the policies we've been talking about are policies that hurt all Americans.
I hate to interrupt, but I've gotten the goodbye sign, and I'm very obedient. I always make deadline. I want to thank everybody for being here. We'll see you next time on CUNY Forum.